So Graham, here we are,
Yep.
Machina Bristronica, our first, first one of the day, really. So what have we got here? What are you showing us?
Okay, I have a few modules that have been out for a little while, but still interesting, I should think. First thing that came out a few years ago, I'll just give a quick rundown because some people may still not be familiar with it. 2 channels of tube distortion, Korg new tube inside, and each channel has independent control of a tilt filter at the input, which can alternately boost or cut bass and treble going into the distortion stage. There's a feedback loop per side for more gain, and wet-dry mix per side, and 2 bias control per side.
So can we use this as an instrument as well? Can we can we feed into it via an instrument? Could I plug a guitar in, for example?
Yes, if you have a module that would take an instrument level input and bring it up to modular level, certainly. It makes actually a pretty nice preamp on bass and baritone guitar that I've tried myself. And the 2 stages are normaled in series. Right now I actually have for the patch set up today. The first stage is getting the feed from one of my crossfaders, which we can talk about in a bit. That's going out to the filter, and then the filter's coming back to the second stage of distortion. So it's getting a little bit of grit, then having that filter down, and then putting a little bit of different grit back on top.
Okay. And what are we going to be feeding it with?
Pardon me?
What are we going to be feeding it with in this chain?
I have a drone going on with 3 oscillator drone coming from this 3 body up here. And then that's fed into one of my crossfaders. It's a triple crossfader, 4 inputs. Each pair of inputs goes to one of the side crossfades, which internally feed the center crossfade. That's getting modulation from some LFOs elsewhere in the system. And so it's constantly morphing between a sort of phase modulation drone of 3 different pitch oscillators. The other crossfader, because these are DC coupled, is handling 2 LFOs, fluctuating random voltage and noise. That's going to VCA that's handling one of the drone voices, so it's giving some variation. The other piece here of the puzzle is a macro controller, one of which is splitting 2 LFOs out to 4 different destinations, giving a master level control over the whole works. Each channel also has its own attenuator, so you can fine-tune whatever that particular destination might be. The other macro controller doesn't have any inputs patched in. There is an internal 5-volt source, so it's essentially working as a manual control for 4 different controls elsewhere in the system, but under one performance control. So in this case, it's controlling the rate of change of that fluctuating random voltage, depth of modulation between the 2 side oscillators to the center oscillator here, and also LFO speeds up here. So it's a way of bringing together a complex patch in a way that's still very performable.
So that's the patch architecture. Maybe we can go through just briefly each module in turn and
Sure.
Talk about this Sonocurrent.
So details on the macro controller, like I said, it gives you 4 channels with individual attenuators and a global group level. That can be linear or exponential curve, and it takes a external control voltage. That can be chained out to a control voltage output. In this case, I don't have a control voltage coming in, so this is just outputting 0 to 5 volts corresponding with the knob position. So in this case, it's actually allowing me to drive 5 different things at once with one manual control. There are inverters on channels 2 and 4, and there's an optional expander, which I don't have patched in for this patch yet, that adds offsets, 5-volt offset to channels 1 and 3, and mutes to all 4 channels, which can be manual, they're latching or momentary, or you can trigger them with anything over 2.5 volt.
Okay, and roughly what are the costs of these modules?
US is $195 and $95, and do the other ones too. The Crossfader's $250 and $325.
That's more reasonable than I was expecting, because these are very kind of premium looking and feeling modules.
I try to keep things approachable. I mean, as we all know, modular does add up.
It gets scary really fast, yeah. Okay, so moving on.
So the Crossfader, as I said, 4 inputs, to 3 crossfade stages. Each input has its own attenuator. Each crossfade stage has its own control voltage input and dedicated attenuator for that. It is DC coupled, as I mentioned earlier, and it also gets CV outputs, which, like the macro controller, in the absence of an input CV, will give you a voltage corresponding to the knob position. In this case, it's plus or minus 2.5 volts because it makes more sense for crossing between two different things. What I'm doing in this case also is I wanted to chain an LFO over to control both of these at the same time. So rather than use a multiple somewhere else, I just have it daisy chained out from one output to the input of the other side. So something of a convenience feature, but you can also use it creatively to build more complex modulation paths.
So when you came to design these, was it from a need that you have? Are you a performer? Do you can perform, and do you think I need modules to do this?
I don't perform too often myself, but what I do tend to make musically is generative, long drone sorts of things. I'm always looking for a way to bring hands back into a patch. It's easy to patch yourself out of your own music.
Right,
and
yeah.
How do you get back into it? How do you bring manual control back? How do you leave points of access to a complicated, somewhat autonomous patch?
Because utility seems to be a big theme running through this.
Yes. That's largely what drew me to modular years ago, is how can you build something that has a workflow that fits what you're thinking? That's partly where the macro controllers came in, because I was building things with like lots of different modulation depths that I wanted to control at one time. Helps you build dependencies between two different things happening in the system at once. And then the crossfader also is a way to sort of make sense of a very complicated patch, but bring things together in a very controllable way.
So I guess the next step is let's hear a bit of it in action. Let's hear a bit of it in action.
Yes, of course.
So what's the crossfader crossfading? Shall we illustrate what the elements are?
So the audio crossfade is sine wave outputs from two of the oscillators. The main drone is a triangle, and then one of the sides I'm also sending a square out to a VCA, which is getting a complex modulator off of the other crossfader, which is what I mentioned earlier, is two LFOs, fluctuating random voltage, and noise. So that's pretty unpredictable, but it's still repeatable. It's just it's such a long cycle, you don't really anticipate where it's coming back to. And then the distortion is essentially end of chain, so whatever's coming out of the main crossfader is getting a bit of distortion, then a low-pass filter, 12 dB low-pass filter, coming back to the second stage of distortion. I think a lot about gain staging and layers of distortion, layers of harmonic complexity. Obviously, there are loads of different ways to approach using a distortion, but this is sort of a standard for what I'm showing this. It gives you a lot of fine control.
Where can people find out more? Where's the website?
Website sonocurrent.com. Also do a fair amount on Instagram, which is just Sonocurrent. And there's a YouTube channel, which I've neglected terribly, but I'm going to be working on that this fall, also under the Sonocurrent name, to have some new demos and new tutorials coming up.
Excellent. Many thanks.